The Cold War period in the United States was one marked by significant changes in how and where Americans lived. Included in that, and driven by a multitude of factors, was the movement of people from homes in cities to homes in the suburbs. I'm your host David, and this week we are looking at the birth of the American suburbs, white flight, and how this was all viewed by the Soviet Union. This is the Cold War. Learning and expanding my knowledge of the world around me is a huge part of my life, which is why I am so thrilled to be working with the sponsor of today's video, a rising star in the streaming world, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is the highest rated documentary streaming app on Google Play, and it offers the best value of any premium documentary streaming service for both its price and especially its quality. And the reason is that Magellan TV is all about the drama of real life. The lives of ancient pharaohs, critical battles in World War I and II, soldiers who fought in the Civil War, the battles for control of the British Crown, the Norman Conquest. Join us in watching RFK, America's Lost President, which looks at the life of Robert Kennedy, the Cold Warrior turned peace advocate who could have been president. Magellan TV has the largest and best collection of history shows anywhere, and since Magellan TV has membership gift cards available, they make the perfect gift as we get closer to the holiday season. Thanks to Magellan TV, gifts for those around me are all sorted out. Not only are there no ads ever, but your subscription always includes 4K. Click the link in the description and join us today. In American history, the early Cold War is closely associated with the expansion of rampant consumerism. The late 1940s and early 1950s were a time of massive economic consumption in the United States as the Cold War between the conflicting political and economic ideologies of American capitalism and Soviet communism began to position consumption into a form of patriotism in the United States. One of the growth industries in the US that would encourage this growing consumerism was the construction and rapid popularization of the suburban neighborhood as the ideal place to raise the all-American family. You know, a husband, a wife, their 2.5 children, a dog, and a Chevy in the driveway. The growth of the suburban lifestyle would play into the new consumerism of the United States as homeownership in the suburbs went hand in hand with soaring rates of car ownership and demand for consumer goods like furniture and home appliances that allowed suburbanites to keep up with the Joneses, as one Chevrolet commercial from the 1950s literally put it. However, this wave of aggressive consumerism was a side effect of the move to the suburbs, not the cause of the middle class's mid-century decision to move out of the big city, a decision which was very much counter to the development of America for the last few decades. Since the Second Industrial Revolution had begun, people had primarily moved into the cities rather than out of them, begging the question, what occurred that was able to reverse this trend? Movement out of the city really begins in the 1910s and reached its peak in the aftermath of the Second World War. Taking that into account, there's one very obvious connection that can be made: the rapid shifting of racial demographics in cities, which begins at approximately the same time that the white middle class begins to leave those cities. The Great Migration of more than 6 million African Americans moving from the South to the North, Midwest, and Western portions of the United States also begins around this time. Between 1910 and 1920, the Black population of major northern cities grew by large percentages, including by 66% in New York City, 148% in Chicago, by 500% in Philadelphia, and a whopping 611% in Detroit. The correlation between the new interest in suburban life and this change in demographics in city populations is why this period of movement to the suburbs has become known as white flight, due to the obvious racial disparity in which demographic groups moved to the suburbs and which ones stayed behind in the cities. From 1920 onwards, there would be consistent increase in white populations moving into the suburbs and a consistent decline in the number of African Americans who would do the same. All of these matters, post-Second World War policies, Cold War ideologies, and racial tensions, would all eventually come together to cause a sharp increase in the number of white middle-class Americans moving to the suburbs in the first decades of the Cold War. The most rapid increase of movement to the suburbs by Americans would begin in the late 1940s with the end of the war. Returning veterans reunited with wives and girlfriends, and soon saw the beginning of the baby boom, in which the US population would rise almost 20% over a single decade. This meant growing families wanted more space. Rapid construction in the suburbs was financially fueled by the post-war Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, popularly known as the GI Bill. This bill gave veterans access to low-interest housing loans, making homeownership an affordable option, especially in the developments being constructed outside of cities, as housing shortages in cities themselves became more common as populations soared. The suburban population increased by 47% in the 1950s, aided by major construction projects like the ones built by William J. Levitt in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey throughout the 1940s and 50s. When construction began in 1947 on Long Island, 1,400 homes were sold in the first 3 hours. These mass-produced homes were created on the same assembly line principles as most modern manufacturing, and a home could be built in a single day with the work of only 36 men, making production extremely rapid. Levitt towns weren't just homes, they were entire suburban neighborhoods with private meeting areas, swimming pools, public parks, and recreational facilities. The homes were generally identical, and the white picket fence, green lawns, and suburban lifestyle that Levitt towns and other neighborhoods like them would provide would become the standard concept of Americana in the eyes of popular culture. The visual representation of social conformity that the suburbs brought with it would only reinforce the expectations of conformity that Cold War paranoia encouraged in American society. Malvina Reynolds' 1962 song Little Boxes satirized the conformity of suburbia with lyrics like, "And the people in their houses all went to the university where they were put in boxes and they all came out all the same." A house with a white picket fence, a traditional nuclear family, a car in the garage, and regular practice consumerism protected you from the Cold War Red Scare, and the Lavender Scare for that matter, where open rebellion against social norms might see you suspected of being a person with communist sympathies. However, these Americana stereotypes would be segregated as both the suburban neighborhood and the administration of the GI Bill, as well as other governmental policies, would help institutionalize and reinforce the racial divide between the suburbs and the city and make white flight even more apparent in American society, as Eugene Burnett would find out in 1949. Eugene Burnett was a returning veteran who was given benefits under the GI Bill and was eligible for a federally guaranteed mortgage as a result. However, as he and his wife Bernice would find in the winter of 1949, being eligible for the mortgage did not automatically mean that they could buy a home in the suburbs. Levittown, New York had sprung up almost overnight on Long Island, and the tract houses were attractive, affordable, and had all the latest appliances and neighborhood amenities that Eugene and Bernice could want. So they dropped in to inquire about purchasing one of the homes using Eugene's mortgage benefit. The problem quickly became apparent when the salesman responded to the Burnett's inquiry with, quote, "The owners of this development have not as of yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes." William Levitt would not sell them a home, nor would he ever sell any homes to any African Americans in his developments. It wouldn't be until 1957 that the first black family would buy a home in the Pennsylvania Levittown, and that was secondhand, not from the Levitt family themselves. Even then, the Myers family would see aggressive harassment from their white neighbors. To this day, the impact of these restrictions can be seen in Levittown neighborhoods, which remain 95 to 98% white. Mr. and Mrs. Burnett would eventually end up buying a home in North Amityville called Roanoke Park. Roanoke Park was one of a few suburban developments that openly advertised itself as having no racial restrictions. Roanoke Park also ended up being predominantly black because, as Bernice Burnett said in one interview, if blacks were accepted, whites wouldn't move there. These unrestricted developments only served to highlight the racial tensions apparent in suburban life. Yet again, even when segregation was not enforced by laws, it happened socially and economically. However, these kinds of restrictions extended far beyond the personal preference of who a private developer would sell to. The GI Bill would not be equally beneficial to both white and black veterans as a result, and home ownership, especially in the suburbs, would remain overwhelmingly dominated by whites. In 1947, half the population of Mississippi was black, but out of 3,000 GI Bill insured VA loans made for homes, only 3 of these home loans were made to black veterans. Other areas of the government played a role in the segregation of housing and white flight as well. The federal government responded to the demand for housing after the war by underwriting a new construction program. Over 10 years, Congress approved billions of dollars of mortgage insurance for the Federal Housing Administration. However, restrictions on mortgage insurance were often created based on race. As far back as the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, would warn that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine the real estate values of a neighborhood. Between 1934 and 1962, less than 2% of mortgages underwritten by the government would go to minorities. The practice of redlining became common with the FHA mortgage program. This practice began in the 1930s with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which graded neighborhoods into 4 categories, in large part based on the racial demographics of a neighborhood. Neighborhoods with minority occupants were marked in red and considered high risk for mortgage lenders. Encouraged by zoning laws and the FHA and VA mortgage insurers that required that participating houses and neighborhoods be good investments, many subdivisions did not allow minority homeowners. The one-drop rule of racial purity applied to neighborhoods as well. Even a single black household in a middle-class area could make the whole neighborhood risky for mortgage loans in the eyes of the federal government. While redlining would impact the Federal Housing Administration and GI Bill loans the most, at least initially, it would eventually spread to the entire mortgage industry, making it much more difficult for minorities to get any type of mortgage in the United States, further exacerbating the racial wealth inequality in America. Now, all of this is very interesting, but I know some of you are wondering what this has to do with the Cold War, aside from occurring during the same time period as America's chilly confrontation with the Soviets. Well, the answer to that is surprisingly a lot. Ultimately, these issues of systemic racism in America would be used in the ideological battles of the Cold War quite frequently by the Soviet Union. National security files from Kennedy's administration show that Soviet media loved to broadcast anything they could get their hands on about racial tensions in the United States. These Soviet broadcasts, which reached audiences in Asia, Africa, and South America, tried to turn global public opinion against the United States. They placed the blame for racism on capitalism itself, and Soviet school curriculum often highlighted the exploitation of black people as a prime example of the inherent hypocrisy of America and the negatives of capitalism. The Cold War's fears of communist influence in the United States would become a major part of the Civil Rights era, sowing seeds of distrust in the federal government and white Americans when the links between communist organizations and many of the leaders of the African American civil rights movement became highly publicized. The Soviet Union had their own issues of racial inequality, of course, mostly related to centuries of Russian anti-Semitism and colonialism that did not vanish after the Soviet Union was formed, but they could easily distract the global community from these failures of Soviet society by making a spectacle of the systemic issues of racial inequality that were all too obvious in American society during this period. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button, no matter if it lives in the city, on a farm, or the ticky-tacky of the suburbs. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.